We have a guest session today. It is our 9th session, and we are in our lecture series within lecture series, My Weather, with Christina Serifi and Anthony Powis, who will talk to you in a few minutes on behalf of MOULD, linking architecture and climate, a very young practice between Berlin and London and other places, also working through academia and other formats, doing mainly research, as you will see, doing some fantastic reflections on what architectural practice is and how it can transform vis-a-vis climate change. So looking very much forward, and Nazli will introduce them in a couple of minutes in more detail. Nazli is with us, Giacomo Rossi, and you have also gotten some of your two sheets with your notions. So let us begin with our concept game today, and the terms on the table are proposed by Christina and Anthony: accountability and vulnerability. So very wonderful topics this morning. And then, of course, a few minutes, as always, about 5 minutes for you to reflect on that. I suggest, of course, that you think about accountability and vulnerability in the context of architectural practice, of your role as designers, or perhaps on other levels also, maybe personal levels, various levels that are currently maybe significant for you. Today, the COP28 started in Saudi Arabia. There's a lot of accountability and vulnerability to be discussed. The chairman of the climate talks is also running the biggest oil corporation of Saudi Arabia. There are accountability questions over there and vulnerability. Accountability and vulnerability. I mean, we are in the context of architectural education. How can education be performative in the context of climate change? Should we be accountable in a certain sense? I don't want to distract you too much. It was more to help you, but let's say whenever you are ready, please feel free to upload your sketches. And we can look at some examples. I will invite actually Anthony and Christina, when your sketches come in, to maybe give some first reactions. Okay, I think it's about time. Let's start. We need to share from here. Okay, so it's a bit different than usual. Okay. Okay, great. Beautiful. Would you like to join over here, Christina and Anthony? And that will be the kind of you will before the official introduction, let's say, but the students can already see your faces and your reactions on that.
Hi. This is fun. It feels like a review now instead of a lecture.
Should you adjust your mic a little bit? Is it working, Giacomo? You have to, it
Yeah.
should be green. Yes, that's good.
Is it working for me?
I think I'm green. Yeah.
You're green. Yes, that's great.
Cool. Oh, very nice.
It's because Giacomo is positioning us.
Great. Let's, beautiful. It's a beautiful wound.
Lovely.
Yes.
A scar, I see.
Scar, yeah.
It makes us vulnerable.
Oh, it's a
Okay.
sad tree. Oh dear.
Concrete tree. But it's breaking through the concrete, I
Very
see,
good.
or the no infrastructure. This I don't see.
No.
Accountability and vulnerability.
Person changed their mind.
I have to think about this, but I'm not sure.
You need to explain us. Is it like a wrecking ball?
A wrecking. It's a wrecking ball. Yes, 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 exactly.
Break the barriers.
Excellent.
Sure.
Wow, that's a lot of stuff. This is a nice diagram, but I cannot read it from here.
Who is accountable? Very nice.
Volcano. Nice.
Mhm.
Don't see anything.
Nice.
This.
Open towards others and not hiding anything. Okay, nice.
Cool. Yes. Without knowing it, this is something that we've tried before this silent conversation,
Mhm.
sharing also little texts, like parts of
Mhm.
texts that we've written,
Mhm.
and having passed the same page from one person to another to really like
that.
comment on that.
Is that
And
right?
it's nice. It's really nice to see these responses.
Nice. Vulnerability as a risk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very Swiss kind of vulnerability, alpine vulnerability.
Yeah.
Is this about, what is this small moments? Nature in urban life. Nature is vulnerable in cities, yes.
Yeah.
Uh,
I like these islands that are nice. It reminds me a little bit of Ungers. The Oswald Matthias Unger's island, Berlin Island City.
Oh, that's beautiful.
That's nice.
Somebody in the safety of their own home. I think lots of people can relate to that. Very beautifully drawn.
Doesn't seem to feel so.
With a lot of these dangerous arrows everywhere, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And not being comfortable. Nice. A little. Okay.
Thresholds.
Little biotop.
We will see probably if any of these sketches relate to your lecture.
Okay.
Or you will completely transform the kind of perception of the students on these issues.
Yeah.
But I think this was interesting, or a kind of interesting input. Everybody is fully awake and ready to begin. So if you like, Giacomo, I think we can change, and then Nazli will introduce Christina and Anthony in a bit more detail, and I wish you a great talk and really look forward to it.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I got it.
Yeah.
Okay, welcome everyone again. It's a great day to continue our My Weather series on this first day of snow. And today's lecture is Architecture is Climate. Our guests Anthony Powis and Christina Serifi are here on behalf of MOULD, which is a research collective working at the intersection of spatial practice and climate breakdown. They're a group of architects and academics based at Technische Universität Braunschweig, Central St. Martins, Goldsmiths, and the University of Sheffield. Their current research project, Architecture is Climate, grew out of the research project Architecture After Architecture, Spatial Practice in the Face of Climate Emergency. It was funded by the German Research Foundation and the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council. Anthony and Christina are part of MOULD's research project, Architecture After Architecture, alongside with Tatiana Schneider, Jeremy Till, Sarah Bowlett, and Becca Völker. Anthony is concerned with architecture's past, present, and future relationships with climate breakdown. He's trained as an architect and studied at Cardiff, Westminster, and the AA. His PhD at Westminster was part of the project Monsoon Assemblages, which looked at the interactions between rapid urban development and changing monsoon climates. Christina is also an architect, a researcher, and urbanist with a practice intersecting research, mapping, and design. Her work is situated in the field of critical spatial practice and explores multicultural heritage related to local technologies, gastronomy, and culture specifics from rural communities in northern Greece. She has been awarded the Fulbright Fellowship and is a Future Architecture Platform Fellow. Today, they will discuss the binds between architecture and climate and what they mean for architecture and climate futures. Instead of the normative questions, what can architecture do for climate breakdown? They will ask, what does climate breakdown do to architecture? And at the end of their lecture, they will also introduce the third and final graded exercise, which they conceived for our series. And Anthony and Christina, we are very pleased to have you here at ONA. Looking very much forward to this lecture. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much.
Nice done.
Yeah.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yes, it's working. Good. Thank you for coming, and thank you for the invitation. This is just to say who we are, but I think Nazli's already done that very well already, so I won't take any time. But my name is Anthony Powis, this is Christina Serifi. We're here as Anthony and Christina, but we're also here as members of MOULD, which is our research collective, alongside friends and colleagues, Jeremy, Becca, Sarah, and Tatiana. And we're here to discuss our current research project, which is called Architecture is Climate. And the essential premise of architecture is climate. It is replacing that word that often comes in between architecture, climate, which can be and climate, for climate, in relation to climate, which always situates architecture outside of climate itself, as if it was somehow separate. Architecture is climate is about implicating architecture in the production of climate. And we'll go into this in a lot more detail through what we're saying. But architecture and climate are conditions that are actually produced through one another. And that puts us in a position where we need to fundamentally rethink architecture from the bottom, not just as a thing that tampers with climate. So the other thing to say right at the start is that the exercise that we're going to introduce at the end of the lecture, or actually in the latter part of the lecture, is using all the elements that we're going to discuss today. So all throughout we're gonna refer back to those. So in a way, this is a very long introduction for the exercise. It's also a lecture which is followed by an exercise. But I'm going to hand over to Christina, who will introduce the premise of the project first.
Yeah, so the premise of the project, of our project, is that architecture as we know it, it's bound to what we call modern project, which is a project which follows the European tradition of from Enlightenment and onwards, now Industrial Revolution, capitalism, etc. So our argument is that climate breakdown makes the very foundations of the modern project unattainable. And we cannot continue, for example, with the same notions of growth, of ordering, of technocracy, which are all tenets basically of the modern project under the conditions of climate breakdown. So therefore, we need to think again, and we need to act otherwise. So if climate breakdown makes the tenets of the modern project unattainable, and if architecture is bound to the modern project in ways that we can discuss later, of course, then the climate breakdown makes architecture as we know it not possible. So this was the first, this is the way that our project started. So we come with this first question, which is, it's basically a question which we encounter in the practice of architecture very, very often, as architects and as educators, which is what basically architecture can do for climate emergency. And this actually very question, we say it's problematic because it situates architecture outside of climate, treating it as a problem to be solved, as an external condition, basically, which can be deployed through professional expertise. It treats climate as something that can be fixed through technocratic interventions of low carbon design. And we know that this also architecture is obsessed with this type of measuring all these interventions through, we know, different certification schemes like LEED or BREEAM. And what architecture is doing here, and we're going to see, is that treating all these problems partially. So moving to the next slide, is that we try to reverse this question, asking, what does climate breakdown do to architecture? And this question basically places architecture within the conditions of climate breakdown, exposing its vulnerabilities and demanding a systemic change across economic, behavioral, and social structures. And this change in societal norms that breakdown demands will accompanied by new spatial formations. No? And we define spatial here as the interaction of social, material, political, human, and natural environments. The argument we are making here, along with others, is that we cannot solve climate breakdown with the very tools that they created. So therefore, one has to look outside of the ways that the modern project has imposed to us and see other ways of addressing and approaching climate breakdown. This is a way of, we're going to show a little bit our research project, which we describe architecture as climate through three parts that they are also inevitably interconnected, and exposing basically the connections of the pasts, the presents, and the futures. And these are foundation practices and futures. And all these parts are related to the exercise that we're gonna introduce in the end. So starting with the foundation, here we talk about the roots of climate breakdown in relation to architecture, and we're going to I'm going to walk you through this diagram that you saw with this little mountain that we create. But before I go to the mountain, basically, this is something that we also, we started thinking creating this diagram is that we argue that climate breakdown is not a natural phenomenon, but a product of capitalism and the modes of thinking with which it approaches and appropriates nature. And as we said, therefore, and as we said before, architecture often only addresses the symptoms and not the causes through different forms of adaptation and mitigation, no? Leaving basically the roots of the breakdown unexamined and undisturbed, allowing all these crises to perpetuate. And this is the architecture's climate diagram that we created, where we explore all these roots of climate breakdown. This is a diagram that we produced as a part of the chronograms of architecture, which was commissioned by Jenks Foundation and eFlax Architecture, and shows this mountain on one side, which is produced by actions that describe the violence of capitalism's imperative of endless growth and the modes of thought that appropriate nature and labor in an exploitative manner. The mountain represents global heating, global heating tracing the rise of atmospheric CO2 on the left side against a linear time scale, as you can see. The rising of the line of greenhouse gas emissions is not an empty abstraction, of course. That's why we did this section, which shows all these violent extractive actions showing as sentiments on the right side. And it's also a line, of course, that we urgently need to consider, and we need to bring it down. These actions that you can see on the section of this diagram describe the ways that architecture is bound to modern project, the ways that dominant architectural production operates, and therefore is complicit in climate breakdown. And as you can see here in this flat section, which is a section that you're gonna also use during the graded exercise, various conditions are met against 6 verbs that I'm gonna go very quickly through, that, as you can see on the left, ignoring, separating, accumulating, exploiting, band-aiding, and violating, and that they're played out within 8 different contexts that we call them also sites of potential intervention, no? Economy, policy, resources, land, infrastructure, knowledge, culture, and labor or work. These ways of operating and the conditions that they're producing are shown as sentimental layers. So you can see all these. We put different examples and actions that indicate the causes of climate breakdown rather than the symptoms, as I said before. And we believe that it's very crucial to understand all these conditions. And it's because this is the only way to face them and somehow resist. So starting with the verb ignoring, here we mean what the modern project and inevitably architecture does, always basically ignores conditions and issues that they fell outside of its purview. And this ignoring arising from unwavering of self-belief, which is an intentional mode of control, ordering, an act of exclusion, basically. In terms of climate breakdown, it becomes a mode of selective amnesia, dealing with conditions that are part of Eurocentric worldview while turning a blind eye to those beyond that. This is, and also we're gonna share with you in the graded exercise that each issue has a sub-issue. So we really like walk through all these verbs, these 6 verbs. and I'm gonna walk you through quickly. We have ignoring consequences. Here it has, and around it we have a lot of different examples. It has to do with forms of denial and delay. And when you confront actual consequences of climate breakdown, commonly results in a kind of paralyzing anxiety. And it's too often these consequences described in terms of threat, of loss, and ignoring consequences basically doesn't make them go away, but displaces them in poorer communities, like regions in the global south. Other ways of being and doing, of course, are most of the times marginalized and unrealistic. But we need these other forms, beyond the dominant ways to be recovered. It's really crucial. Ignoring social justice, which is something that, because climate action is often framed through scientific and technocratic worldview, it tends to ignore all the social impacts. And we argue that social justice and climate justice are interlinked. We mentioned below about about this dualistic worldview, which is an identified feature of modernity, which a capitalist enterprise, which is a project of separating issues in order to better control them and privileging one domain over the other. These are also we have also different examples. Separating forms of knowledge, which is something that academia is doing, and wider societal structures organize themselves in separating disciplines based on particular forms of knowledge, and disciplinary boundaries somehow are guarded. And it's important, we argue here that it's important also to understand the world as a network of all these situated relations and interconnections. Separating functions from each other, it's this urge to divide functions and policies within themselves as well, like separate ministries or buildings that are defined by functional type, or cities that are divided into U zones, imposing fixed typologies where alternative, more flexible or locally specified practices could flourish. Separating humans from nature, like all the monoculture practices of industrial agriculture. And then we have accumulating. And here we're talking about this obsession with growth and the ways in which growth is measured and championed, and how important it is also to separate progress from endless growth. Accumulating control within the realms of politics, for example, or economics, posing restriction. The most, and we know now that the most effective climate-facing initiatives are the ones that they resist in such monopolized systems of control. Accumulating identity at the personal, institutional, or corporate or national level, especially in architecture, the elitistic system of star architects now obscuring all this, the interdependent role of architecture, or that what architecture actually needs to have. Accumulating staff, and in relation to architecture here, we're talking about the obsession with the new, obscuring the labor, the land, natural resources. Accumulating wealth, which is self-explanatory, I would say, is what late capitalism is marked by: growing wealth inequality, extending also to carbon emissions, where the wealthiest contribute double to the CO2 emissions of those of the poorest. The next and the other verb is exploiting. which is the carbon state, which is linked with in many forms of exploitation, spanning from aggressive extraction of resources to mistreatment of workers, to the harmful impacts of carbon-intensive construction and waste. Architecture is also complicit in this process, exploiting labor, where architecture, when it's conceived from isolation, we don't know who is doing the things that we design, and the things that actually enable its very creation. It's important to introduce more ethical and transparent labor practices, exploiting land, land speculation, privatized land, denying basically people to access to viable land for self-sustainment, and the misuse of land as carbon sink for offsetting emissions worsens this situation. Exploiting natural resources, as we said before, the industrialization of nature and practices, including logging and fracking, that supply all these construction materials that architecture uses, basically, and also the waste disposal. And we move to band-aiding, which is something we believe, very crucial also method in architectural world. This band-aiding fixes of treating problems separately, dealing with symptoms, without acknowledging all these underlying relational causes. There are these band-aids which are partially temporal and disconnected. For instance, carbon offsetting is here, is championed because it's somehow, despite being a kind of no displacement activity, moving your things somewhere else. Recognizing connections between disciplines is also really, really important in the sense. But we talk about band-aiding by disciplining. We're addressing climate breakdown through isolated solutions within disciplinary silos, often overlooks systemic issues, perpetuating all these global inequalities, and by building as well, which is this approach of architecture by treating problems only by building. Maybe building, it's not always the solution. And then we go to violating, which is the last of the sentiment, which is here we're talking about how capitalism driven by focus to profits and competition violates social and natural relations that have evolved over time, undermining our ability to address long-term challenges. We're talking about violating boundaries, ecological boundaries or planetary boundaries, ethical boundaries through exploitative labor conditions, identities, which business as usual overrides most of the times other forms of identity. And rights and capabilities, which is this also extends back to colonization that continues today, especially regarding indigenous ways of being and their ability to self-organize, empathize, to learn collaboratively, to negotiate, which is crucial to face climate breakdown. And all these actions and issues, as we call them, which is as I walk you through, they're here at play within these 8 different contexts or sites, which describe social and spatial contexts in which climate breakdown and architecture are both produced and experienced. So they represent a range of conditions which architecture needs to operate with and within in order to face climate breakdown. And this is how we created this matrix, like checking where each of the issues or these verbs, what is doing in each of separate sides. So we call them sides, as we said. They describe not only the underlying conditions that they shape architecture, but also the ways in which future spatial practices need to engage. They hold the issues that they contribute to climate breakdown, so they present at the same time the potentials for intervention and transformation. That's why they have this duality. They place architecture within a context of socio-political dynamics that in both influences and influenced by. So we already know the devastating effects now of the capitalist economic system, enacting distributed, shared, ethical economies engenders new social and spatial spatial formations, all of which they have also implications to architecture, policies that are often attributed to elites are criticized for their ineffectiveness. This is why, and we believe this is why all the citizen assemblies, practices for participatory governance, and other forms of redistributed decision-making are crucial. This in resources also we're talking about, here you can see all these examples about over-intensive extraction of resources and the polluting effects that they have of their consumption, where vastly contributes also to climate breakdown. Knowing the origins, the production and the methods of materials, the projects and the products, and acting upon its knowledge is crucial. Well, land which is wounded and depleted, and acknowledge. Here we're also arguing for acknowledging land as a living being, as a vibrant entity that sustains life, with rights of its own. It's part of more emancipatory spatial practice. Well, infrastructures, which are critical support systems, and they are inseparable from climate. It's important also a deep understanding of infrastructures, both in material and immaterial ways. So knowledge, including that of architecture, is somehow a guardian canon. No? We talk about this idea of creating systems that are more interconnecting, opening up all these ways of knowing and acquiring knowledge. And this is where the culture of seeing and doing architecture, where it normally prioritizes aesthetics over labor. So we talk also about how it can become a shared realm, and not the domain of the few. And then last we have labor, which we argue that is not an abstract form, but is a human condition, and how important is to address all the labor injustices that we also see in this column, and open up a different sensibility to the way that architecture is conceived and practiced. So going back to this whole diagram, I mean, you can see a lot of stuff that we put there in every type of workshop that we're doing. We're also adding different examples. So it's getting, somehow blacker all the time, worse, because all these kind of sentiments that we have here with this black color, it's It's quite heavy, but what I want to say is that we don't want to see also only this example, this diagram as through all these violent and accumulative actions, but actually as through the actions of resistance, through the actions of hope, and through the actions of solidarity, that all these type of rifts, all these white spaces, all these white pockets, this is what they're showing here. And we believe that these actions they exist within gaps in the present and actually show us new futures. And these actions of resistance, it's something that, as we're borrowing the term from Andy Merrifield, create new relationships with space, with time, with work that undermine somehow the violence of all these issues or problematics that I was telling you before quickly. And they create gaps within the present. And this is something that we have been also putting together, like holding hands or bringing together all these different practices that they exist. And it's important actually to nurture and connect them. And this is where Anthony comes into play, to have to show you a little bit more hope.
So thank you, Christina. That was the hard part. And now I get to do the kind of nicer part.
Yes.
So lucky me. So if foundations then is the first stretch, which sets up the critique, which establishes this idea of the root causes of climate breakdown, which the things which build the mountain, the ways of thinking and doing which have got us into the situation we are, which are also deeply embedded in architectural practice. And then the second part of the project, which is practices, catalogues a number of architectural practice projects and also things which are really seemingly non-architectural, which play out across those other sites that Christina just described, but which face those issues directly. So we're talking with things that are already existing, not inventing from scratch. We're not trying to come up with new forms of architecture from nowhere, but we're looking at those gaps in the present, things that are happening, things that are real, but things which are facing root causes, not just dealing with symptoms. So this is an example of a practice in our database. And by the way, we're talking about something which is going to be all documented in a website, which is going to go live in a couple of months' time. We have a database about 150 of these things at the moment. And you'll see that on the left-hand side, each one relates specifically to a number of issues that it faces. So you can read a project like this, and this is one of the more architectural projects in the database, as an architectural project, which does a number of nice things. What we're really interested in is the way that it faces those issues of climate breakdown in a very direct, getting to the roots, and also how it plays out in specific sites beyond the traditional boundaries of an architectural project, how it gets involved in the edges of architectural practice through those various sites of intervention, which sort of overlap with, but also largely sit outside of the architectural project. And then how it suggests actually other forms of architecture on the right-hand side, how it leads into transformations of those sites and other ways of thinking and doing. So I'll just run through a number of examples, starting with that one of how we're doing this. So a project like this social housing office in the Balearic Islands, which is a collaboration between government agencies, architects, economists, and others, could be read as a very nice thing, which uses local materials. It uses sandstone, it uses reeds that wash up on the beach. It can be read as appropriate technology, energy efficiency, all these kind of terms that we know quite well and we understand as being the realm of architecture. So this is them using this very abundant form of seagrass as insulation on the roof of a social housing project. But in order to do this, they actually had to do a number of things which were quite complicated. They had to divest from international structures of procurement, whereby they would typically buy their insulation materials from a company in Germany, which was using certain toxic chemicals, which was bringing these things into people's homes in the islands in I think this project's in Mallorca, but in the Balearic Islands more generally. They also had to design new systems of labor. They had to train people to be able to do this because they may be only trained in certain ways of building. They had to design new economic structures within the housing office to be able to procure it. And they had to support the companies that were then going to create this, this construction method. So it's dealing with things on the surface. It's also dealing with underlying issues, the globalization of supply chains, toxic building products, fragmentation of housing delivery, and the lack of holistic approaches. So the fact that this housing office had to actually rebuild the way that a housing office worked in order to do that. And you can also see this as addressing those root causes that Christina's just described. So the accumulation of control, the centralization of operations, the separation of forms of knowledge, and the violation of agency. So the violating capability of a local government to just do things in a way that they would like to, using local materials and resources and labor. And also, of course, the exploitation of natural resources that relates to the use of appropriate technologies. So this is an example to tell you about an interesting project, but also our way of reading things, which is about going beyond. And it's beautifully summed up in this quote, actually, that they're building a house, but they're also building an ecosystem to inhabit. And of course, plays out across these other sites beyond, as I say, the typical boundaries of what you might think of as an architectural project. That's not to say the architect has to do all these things, but they have to collaborate, they have to work with, they have to understand, and in some ways get involved and mess around with. Another example in our database is a project called Sweetwater Foundation, which is in Chicago in the US. It's a response to the defunding and degradation and deliberate blight of urban neighborhoods, predominantly inhabited by Black people on the South Side of Chicago, and the will to create safe communities, but also ecologically sustainable communities. They built a thing called the Commonwealth over a number of vacant plots, which includes gardening, amazing experiments in retrofitting existing houses, building community agriculture and also arts projects, and doing loads and loads of outreach and education. So again, this can be read as a wonderful retrofit project, a nice bit of community agriculture, and a nice way of integrating arts and culture into regeneration. But actually what they're facing is centuries-long history of the removal of land rights, the segregation of property, racial segregation of property, the fact that Black people were unable to purchase property in certain areas of the city that tied them into landlordism, absentee landlords, generations of wealth building that were lost, estimated in the millions. So actually they're dealing with financial inequality, they're dealing with racial segregation, they're dealing with the idea of blight and the sort of naturalization of disrepair, which is kind of created through that ecological metaphor of blight, something that happens to trees, something that, oh, it's just going on, but is often deliberately policy-led, and the loss of employment in certain areas. So again, you can go right down and say, well, yes, they're doing retrofit and community agriculture, but actually they're facing issues about exploiting land, about violating spatial rights, and about ignoring social justice. Another one in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil by a studio called Ooze, which is about creating a decentered water network for wastewater. It's dealing with sanitation and nature-based systems and urban greening. But it's also a deeply community-based project, which is based on education, which is based on collaboration, which is based on a way of thinking about infrastructure in urban areas. And therefore, it's also facing ideas around what infrastructure is and does. Typically, infrastructure is delivered through the mechanization of nature, delivered through the construction of hard sewers, delivered through ways of dealing with modern, as Christina said, modern forms of design that take on the problems of climate, like changing rain patterns. And therefore, it's facing the issue of band-aiding by building. We've got a problem, we'll throw a structure at it. It's facing issues of separating humans from nature and ignoring consequences. And I'm going to skip ahead because we have limited time. But here's an example of forest gardening and the generation of ecological systems which are based on other forms of value, as also seen through a project in Girona by Studio Martí Franch, which is essentially generating a different form of value to the capital-based construction project where you throw a load of materials at something. This is a new landscape generated purely by long-term collaboration with maintenance workers. It's a different form of architecture practice which faces those underlying issues and suggests other ways of doing and making. So this is a quick flick through, and I apologize for the speed, a number of things that are in the database, celebrating the indigenuity as this architect, Juan Ango, who's a Sami architect and artist, in indigenous cultures rather than caricaturing them of types of building. Working with community-based economics. This is Civic Square in Birmingham, working on donut economics and ways of people-powered retrofit. Designing deconstruction, Rotor in Belgium, sorry. Not only creating ways of reusing buildings, but building systems which deal with the lack of education around the use of secondary materials. Michael Sorkin, imagining a new city through policy statements. And Dark Matter Labs in the UK, starting with the problem of housing and the lack of housing, and arriving eventually at the idea of Fairhold, a new system of land ownership, going down to root causes on the basis that you can't just deal with building new housing if the underlying system that's creating housing inequality stays intact. So that's a very, very quick run through some of the practices, but I hope it's suggesting ways in which, and this is something that we're going to ask you to do, ways in which you can frame a piece of work which is on the surface maybe doing a certain number of things and thinking about what it's actually facing in terms of those issues of the root causes of climate breakdown. Because our suggestion is from that facing of the issues of the root causes actually leads to far more interesting futures which don't just stay in relation to the symptoms. It rains too much, it's cold, we do warmer buildings, or it's hot, in fact, but actually suggest new forms of practice. So our construction of futures is about drawing out of all those interesting practices in the database, alternative models for spatial practice as forms of action that face and remake root causes of climate breakdown, which this is something we're going to ask you to work with, these things sitting in relation to different sites of intervention, different places that you might need to get involved in and collaborate with in order to deal with the kind of blockages you're facing in your project. You want to do something, you can't do it. Why is that? And this is our approach to futuring in this project is kind of informed by this quote from Arturo Escobar about the creation of futures that have a future as a design principle. And we read this as the idea that you need to not be didactic, not be prescriptive. Our form of futuring is not a prescription to how to practice, but a set of modes of operation that can be interpreted and build on one another, that can create futures that have futures. And indeed, which can not define a form of action, but allow for many, many ways of thinking, as summed up in this quote. But there are also prompts for thinking outside of the ways in which we're taught to do things. And this is the suggestion that, as in this wonderful line from Lola Olufemi's book, we're taught a set of limits to what is possible. And those limits are embedded with, embedded in, or they embed in us, those ways of thinking that Christina described in the diagram. And that actually to imagine beyond those structural limits, those systems that we're put in place and that we're taught in places like this is really difficult. So we offer, and we start to offer a kind of set of prompts, which I'll let kind of cycle on the screen behind me as I talk through them, which don't come from nowhere. They come from those practices. They come from real existing examples of things in the world, and which propose broad approaches to architecture and spatial practice in relation to climate. And this is, by the way, something we're going to give you all these, so don't panic. I know they're going rather quickly. In the eventual project, these prompts, these forms of future will refer back to specific practices, but also to specific issues and sites in which they can be executed, let's say. And one thing we're going to ask you to do in your exercise is to select a number of these in which to examine your own work. We'll go straight to the exercise.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so the way that we're going to frame this exercise then is about the word vulnerability. This is one of the words that we started the day with. Vulnerability is a really tricky and in some ways dangerous word. There are forms of vulnerability which are induced by climate, which in terms of social inequality, in terms of geographic, regional, gender, racial, other inequalities. In a way, we're not talking about those kind of vulnerabilities. We're talking about vulnerability, which I think someone said in the opening exercise, as a form of openness, as a form of openness to change, as a form of openness and willingness, and actually recognizing the need to change. And as we said in the opening of the talk, the idea of architecture is climate, and the implication that climate breakdown therefore begets a form of architectural breakdown, demands on us that we therefore change architectural practice, that we see ourselves as architects, as professional people, as disciplinary actors, as vulnerable, that we don't know the thing that we're going to do. We don't know the way that we need to act. We don't have the solutions necessarily. We have tools, we have ideas, we have knowledge, we have skills, but we may not know the precise boundaries of our practice, certainly not in the future, but probably also not now. And so taking on those prompts is a form of admitting to vulnerability. And so the graded exercise we're going to ask you to do is taking all three of those parts of the project architecture as climate in relation to your own practice. And I'm going to hand over to Christina to discuss it.
Stay.
No?
Yeah,
Okay.
we'll do it together.
I'll do the first part. So the first part of the graded exercise is to take a project, which could be a design project. It could be something in your own life. It could be a situation that you encounter at home. It's a problem. Give yourself a brief. Okay. Take your own project. The important thing, and the reason I was saying that, is it's something you know very well. It's not something you know superficially. But let's assume you do. what we want you to do is using the diagram that we started with, using those verbs, and we'll give you all those verbs and the issues and a description of which mean what they mean, is identify a number of them as issues and blockages related to what you're trying to do. So if you think about the example in the Balearic Islands, they were trying to do construction with local materials. They were trying to do cheap social housing that was well insulated, that was built with non-toxic materials. The issues that they were facing was not that they had difficulties in constructing that. The issues that they were facing, as I said, were about the globalization of supply chains, about the centralization of control, about so you can frame a superficial problem in relation to fundamental issues and root causes. And that's what we're asking you to do here. And this is an example from a workshop that Christina actually ran with students in TU Berlin, where they were placing their situations directly in relation to the diagram, directly on the diagram. So you're working with a certain site and issues, and you may have a number of places where you find yourself in here. The second part that we want you to do is, therefore, once you've picked a number of issues and sites, draw a diagram which sets out in a kind of relational way how your project encounters certain conditions, how the problem you are facing is related to elements of your project, to different actors, to different issues and sites. And this is something that we've done with students in other institutions, but also professionals through things like systems diagramming. This is from another workshop in Milan, dealing with the idea of climate delay or climate denial. Where does that come from? What's that interrelated with? So you can spin out from a central issue into related ideas. And one of the examples we've given you also in the exercise is this artist called Stephen Willett, who was operating in the 1960s in Whitechapel and made these wonderful collages which connected different issues like isolation within social housing to wider economic policy and other social issues. So this is an idea of using diagram, which may also incorporate collage, etc. This is actually about people's happiness in their marriages in suburban housing. And you go through different forms of housing. But again, forms of diagramming which connect an issue to its wider social, environmental, etc. contexts. And this also partly comes from the famous world model diagram, systems diagramming, which was used in the Limits to Growth report, Donella Meadows and others, also in the 1960s.
Yeah, so I came from the back to the nice part. I know in the beginning I was talking a lot about issues. So in the part 2 here of this of the exercise, so first we ask you to do, as Anthony said, a diagram connecting all the issues and the blockages that your project faces, but talking mostly about the root causes, not the superficial, like problematics, which was very helpful what Anthony showed about the practices, like how you really show that in these different layers. So in the part 2, now we're asking that you select from forms of action and interventions that we're going to share with you to choose some of at least 3 sites. So these are some of the forms of actions and interventions that basically will help you to overcome these issues. So what we're asking you to do is to choose the sites, situate your project within the sites that you are and the conditions that you are working on, your project is being situated in, and then choose some of these actions and interventions that will help you somehow break these blockages. Unlock, exactly. Unlock the issues and unlock this kind of, blocks. We run these tests, this exercise with also different practitioners. So they somehow put 4 or 5 of the projects and they run them into this matrix that we have with all the prompts. As you see, this is the diagram, we call it the diagram of hope. The previous one, there was the diagram of despair. So now we are flipping the diagrams. So yeah, as you see, they chose, I mean, in this exercise, it seems that they chose some of the prompts and then they came out with some different like ways of doing their work, or how basically some of them they tested all projects already and see how they could be changed. I don't know, talking about more than human policies, for example, or commoning, how their project could be transformed in a way of dealing with this or addressing commoning, or yeah, regenerative agriculture. And these are some ways of diagramming. Basically, we're passing you some, if you would like. So the part 2B, it's now to reimagine how your project could be transformed through this type of prompts that we send you, discovering openings for possible futures, how it could be different, how could be, let's say, something new, that it will be overlaid. So this new diagram, here we're asking you to draw a new diagram, which would be overlaid on top of the other diagram, the original one that you have, with tracing paper. So the idea is that both, we don't want you to really do something which is completely different. We need to keep the trace, which is important, of what was before there, to really see the line. And that's why we thought it's interesting to have something which underlies, I mean, overlays above each other. These, for example, are some diagrams also that we did with Milan students, talking about climate awareness and all this kind of different forms of action around that, and yeah, and where, in which sites actually this needs to be addressed. Other diagrams that we can pass through. We put a number
of these in also mostly as kind of visual forms to say that the form of diagramming can be quite systems based and technical and flowcharty. It can be much more inventive as well. This is a product of a workshop of a number of weeks with students in Milan, actually the same as the climate diagrams, but the final products became much more creative and collagey, and also again the kind of work of Stephen Willits and artists who've used overlays and forms of highlighting certain sections of a diagram to say, actually, here is a point where if you've set out the kind of the world of the crap that you're dealing with, here is something we can change, here is something we can rearrange in order to bring different outcomes. And in fact,
the important thing before, sorry, the important thing on this diagram is that we also we were asking you to form like a short 120 words critical response that will be part of the last diagram, on the second one. It will have to do something with, yeah, how you reimagine the future of this new formation that you are designing there or planning. And it could be part, as you can see here from Stephen Willits, it could be part as little quotes. Mm-hmm. So it's up to you.
Yeah. Okay.
And thank you.
And thank you.
We have a bit of time, and I have a lot of questions, but I think it would be really fair and somehow exciting for me to also hear from the students, and for us. So would you like to engage in a conversation with Anthony and Christina? How do you? Yeah, on any kind of question. I mean, also the kind of practical questions on the exercise. I think anything is just raise your hand or call out. I'll bring the mic. I've seen your hand, right? If you want to come a little bit down so everybody can see you, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Amazing. No, about not the exercise, the question. We were talking yesterday in the studio of Brandon Hooper, and I was thinking that, yes, as a student, architecture student, we are living in a maybe shifting moment. But at the same time, every time that we step out of the school or the university and we enter the office life, there is not correspondence between what we study and we learn and what we get to know and what really happens then when we work. So it's always a bit not really a happy moment as well to enter the practice, because in a way we start to have the knowledge or the consciousness, but there is always this gap then in the practice in it.
That's an excellent point. Thank you very much. So the practice, do you want to address the practice?
Yeah, well, this is a very good question, because we also face that in our studies. First, that yeah, we were saying that what you are studying, it doesn't really represent what is happening outside of the world. But when you go outside to work, you work in places that they don't really, correspond to your beliefs somehow. But what we were saying here, it's also, I mean, the whole system somehow tries to really impose this individual responsibility, feeling like, oh, you're doing something wrong, and that's why we're talking about the more systemic change. So you're not doing anything wrong. I mean, you need also to go to work in any office. So I think this is also important to be said. We're not moving the finger here to anyone or showing the finger, but it's really important to I don't know, for me personally, I found very hopeful to really team up with people that you have similar, I don't know, like thoughts, or you are dealing with similar issues, because you're going to see that you're not alone. There are many, many people out there. And for us, it was really hopeful. Although we start, like, firstly in our project, really talking about all these root causes of climate breakdown, it was really hopeful to see all these practices that they don't exist now only, that they have been really there for for the whole period of time.
I think that's supposed to be the encouraging part of it.
Yeah.
And actually, I think there's a sense of reality to that these things exist in the world, these things and ways of people challenging form of architecture practice is also not very new. It exists in the world, it exists outside of architecture practice, it exists in ways which can, you can work in if you want and build on, and this is in a way more realistic than a form of practice which is actually based on basically denial of the conditions of the world.
Right. Of course, I mean, I think that of course practice moves slower than academia, and practice is more entangled, to say so, in the within the systemic problems, because we have that what is called academic freedom, luckily, right? So we have a space in which we can consider different worlds, different practices. We are ahead in a way, right? So that's the gap that you're talking about, right? And what should you do? I mean, by all means, I would say organize and start your own practices, fight for it. I mean, fight for it with your own, energy.
Exactly.
Invest your time, pull together resources with your friends, think about how to do it differently. Great.
Another question.
Yes.
Thank you. It's maybe a bit too direct, but to which degree do you actually believe in this agency you talk about, or this practicing outside of the conventional realms of the practice? Because, I mean, those disciplines are the market, the economy, and politics, where, to put it in a, and I don't like it, but to put it in a realistic sense, that's where decisions are taken.
Yeah.
So how many of your friends or colleagues or people in your age group, the interesting young people doing things in the city, are actually in politics, are actually in the market, and are not just inventing new ways of making old diagrams?
No, it's a really good question, but I think, I mean, I do believe in it. Basically, to answer the question, I do believe in it, and I believe in it in the sense that also we have examples that we haven't spoken about, which maybe we'll include in the database, things like non-architectural examples, things like the Preston model, which is in the north of England, where the local council, under massive underfunding, decided that they would just spend all of their existing budgets, like the police, the hospitals, the town hall, all the money they already spend in the local area. And they had to redesign all their contracts, and they had to redesign their procurement systems, and this is why it's economics and policy, etc. But that, and they came up with this idea of procuring for social value. And so they invented something systemic, which then had all these kind of rippling effects of building up jobs in the local area, small businesses, which then meant the regeneration of certain industrial areas, certain things, and rippling effects. And that's taking something they were at a really dire place because of underfunding of local government, particularly in the north of England. And they took a systemic, kind of like quite desperate, radical approach to it. And I guess I just think that those structures that you're talking about, the normative structures, they're not going to last. They're already cracking, they're already creaking, they're already breaking, and everywhere where they do that, something else has to come in, and I do believe that can replace them, because it will have. I mean, it will have to. Things change. That's also why we put up the quote from Lola Olufemi, and that's an amazing book, Experiments in Imagining Otherwise. It's all about the way in which you're conditioned to think that nothing can change, and we're straitjacketed by. This is the limits of your ability. This is the limits of your ability to imagine. And so I stick to it and I try to stick to the optimism.
Yeah, we wouldn't, to answer also, I mean, we have the Chilean constitution also in our database. Now, I mean, we wouldn't be here, to be honest, if we wouldn't believe that. It's really hard to do it if you don't really do it also in your own practice. And the Chilean constitution, of course, it didn't eventually pass in the parliament, but parts of it that it's talking about the right of nature, the right of indigenous people, they are implemented, and they are also changing in Ecuador or Argentina, despite the recent politics. But this shows this little, how things could change little by little. And also for us, I mean, for in our own practice, I mean, we graduate from the schools like you right now, and then it's, I mean, you start working in some offices, but then little by little you join hands with other people to create things that they're a little bit, they give you joy, and then these things somehow they become bigger. It happens. Yeah.
I don't have a voting right in Switzerland, but maybe, I can influence from here.
Go to your...
Yes.